When people learn that I'm a coach, I get a lot of the same questions over and over. And most of these questions revolve around running form. So people either want me to evaluate their running form as a whole, or they have some specific question about their heel striking tendencies, or they think their cadence is too low, or, something of that nature. And this is really interesting to me because I think running form is one of the least interesting and least impactful things to be focusing on as a runner. I would much rather talk about your training methodology and what types of workouts you're doing, your mileage, your training frequency, all of these things. But I think for a lot of people, running form just feels more tangible. And it's like, if I make this little adjustment to my form, maybe I'll get faster, or maybe I'll reduce my risk of injury, or whatever. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about running form and some of the advice you're going to see around the internet and which aspects of it matter, which aspects of it can be safely disregarded, and which aspects are just flat out wrong. And I think a good place to start is with your cadence. So cadence, if you're not familiar, is the number of steps you're taking per minute. So if you take 160 steps per minute, that's a cadence of 160. And you can measure this with whatever device you're using to track your run. So if you've spent any time at all in running communities online, on social media, following running coaches and running influencers, or if back in the day you read a running magazine, you probably have seen this number of 180 being the golden rule of cadence. So you want your cadence to be 180 steps per minute. First of all, I'm going to spoil it for you. This does not matter. Most people are not running with a cadence of 180. And to explain why, we need to talk about where the number actually came from. So at the 1984 Olympics, the famous running coach Jack Daniels observed the stride rates of the distance runners who were there competing at the highest level. And what he found was that pretty much all of them had a cadence of 180 steps per minute or higher. This observation made its way into his book and then into other coaching resources, and it eventually became this gospel, this prescriptive thing of if you want to get faster as a runner, you need to be running 180 steps per minute. And it makes sense, right? It's logical to think that if the elite runners are running at 180 steps per minute, then if you want to get faster, maybe you should be running at 180 steps per minute. The thing is, these were elite athletes in competition running all out. Of course they have a high cadence. That's part of what makes them fast. And the thing we have to realize is that cadence is very closely tied to running speed. As you run faster, you're naturally going to have a higher cadence. And in fact, there are only two variables that determine how fast you run. And that is your stride rate, which is your cadence, and your stride length. If you think about it, the only two ways to run faster are to take more steps over a set distance or to take bigger steps over that distance. So when you increase your speed, it's going to come from those two variables. So of course, these elite athletes have a high cadence because they're running at paces that would make most of our heads spin. But if you looked at these same athletes when they're out on a slow recovery jog, the chances are slim that you would find them running at 180 steps per minute. So all of that to say, don't stress about your cadence. Don't obsess over this number of 180. Cadence is highly individual, and it's also tied to the paces you're running. So it's going to look different, not only between different athletes, but between different types of runs performed by the same athlete. The next thing we need to talk about is foot strike. This is another point of contentious debate within the running community, so let's settle this once and for all. So there are basically three types of foot strike that you can have as a runner, and they all revolve around which part of your foot hits the ground first. So there's a heel strike where your heel hits the ground first. Then there's a midfoot strike where the ball of your foot and your heel hit the ground almost simultaneously. So the ball of your foot hits first, and then your heel makes contact a split second later. And then there's a forefoot strike with the ball of your foot hitting the ground first, with your heel barely touching or not touching the ground at all. Forefoot striking is really only natural during sprinting or running uphill. You don't see a lot of runners who naturally run with a forefoot strike in normal conditions. So the debate tends to be between midfoot striking and heel striking. Is one better than the other? Is one correct? You've probably heard the claim that heel striking is like running with the brakes on. I actually use this analogy with overstriding, which we'll talk about in a minute, but not with heel striking, because it's just not accurate. Now, what is fair to say is that when you heel strike, you kind of coast during the support phase before you can start driving forward again. So there's a brief moment during every stride where there's not really any forward propulsion happening, but at normal running speeds, the time you spend in this phase is so small that it really isn't going to have that much of an impact for most runners. Now, what the research does show is that biomechanically, a midfoot strike produces less impact force than a heel strike. And impact force is something we look at for injury risk. We've also seen studies that show that a higher percentage of faster runners tend to run with a midfoot strike compared to slower runners. But we do need to be careful about drawing conclusions here. Correlation doesn't equal causation, right? And it's likely that faster runners don't become fast because they midfoot strike. They midfoot strike because of the faster paces they're running. It's interesting to see how this plays out in races. There have been studies of marathoners that have shown that many runners who start the race with a midfoot strike will end the race with a heel strike as they're becoming more fatigued and starting to slow down. So often, just like cadence, the foot strike is correlated directly with the pace that you're running. There was also a fascinating study out of George Washington University that challenged the idea that running barefoot would automatically create a midfoot strike. Researchers studied a population of habitually barefoot runners in northwest Kenya called the Dasanak. The assumption was that all of these barefoot runners would naturally tend toward midfoot striking because what we've been told is that that's the natural human gait. But what the study found is that most of them actually heel strike. Some of them transition to a midfoot strike when they start running faster, but even at faster paces, heel striking remained common. So this totally contradicted the idea that people throw around all the time, which is like, oh, go run without shoes and you'll see what the natural running form looks like. You're gonna run on the balls of your feet, not on your heels. In reality, that may not be the case. So the question is, do you need to change your foot strike? I would say probably not, unless you have a specific reason. If you're a heel striker who's running injury-free, you're making consistent progress in your training, you probably don't need to make any changes. But if you are dealing with chronic injuries or you feel like your movement pattern is inefficient, it may be worth experimenting with a transition to a midfoot strike, ideally with the help of a coach or a physical therapist. It is important to make any transition gradually. Runners who transition too quickly from a heel strike to a midfoot strike will often just trade one set of issues for another. Midfoot striking puts a lot more stress on your calves and your Achilles tendon, and if those structures aren't ready for that new loading pattern, you're gonna have problems along the way. Change is not going to come quickly or easily, so if you do decide to make some adjustments, I don't recommend doing it in the midst of a training block. If you've got a race on the calendar, leave it for later, and if you're actually getting injured and that's the reason you're trying to make changes, maybe postpone the race and take some time to make the transition properly. But again, for most people, adjusting your foot strike probably isn't necessary. And so now I want to get to what actually does matter. What matters a lot more than your foot strike itself is where your foot is landing in relation to your body. Whether you're a heel striker or a midfoot striker, you want your foot to be landing under your center of mass, under your hips. So when you land, your tibia, your shin, is about at a 90-degree angle to the ground, and you're able to transition right into that forward propulsion phase because your foot is right under your center of mass and it can push down and back right away. When your foot lands too far out in front of your body, we call this overstriding. And overstriding is where the real problems happen. In fact, many of the problems that are often blamed on heel striking are actually overstriding problems. Now, heel striking is associated with overstriding. It's often indicative that you may be overstriding, but some people are just biomechanically built to be heel strikers because of their leg length or their proportions or whatever, and you can heel strike without overstriding. And if you're heel striking without overstriding and you're not having any issues, that is completely fine. But when you overstride, that's when we have that problem of the braking effect that people talk about. It's not because you're landing on your heel, it's because you're landing with your foot out in front of your body instead of under your center of mass. Doing this puts a lot of eccentric stress on your hamstrings. It can put your knee in a bit of a compromising position. And it's also just inefficient because it creates this dead spot in your gait cycle where your center of mass has to catch up to your foot before your body can be pushed forward. So it's inefficient, it's probably slowing you down, and it is associated with a higher risk of injury. If you notice that you do have a tendency to overstride, one of the cues that you can focus on is just shortening your stride in front of your body. So you're gonna take more steps, you're gonna take shorter steps, and you just wanna focus on landing on the ground directly under your hips. At higher speeds, it may actually feel like you're landing behind your hips. Now, you're not technically, but it may feel that way, and I think that's a helpful cue. Now, aside from overstriding, if you want to improve your form, there are actually some really good natural form teachers that you can work into your training. So the first one is running uphill. Running up a gradual hill, like a 2 to 5% grade, is a great way to force your body to naturally adopt better mechanics. You're going to get that nice forward lean because you're going to be leaning into the hill. Your foot's going to be landing under your body and you're not going to be able to overstride because the hill is going to be in the way. I would also recommend working strides into your routine. Strides are short accelerations, anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds, up to around your max all-out speed. Now, you're not hanging out at that speed for very long. You're kind of just getting up to that speed, settling in for a second, and then immediately backing it off. And what this does is it trains your neuromuscular system at speed. Your cadence is going to be higher, your foot strike is naturally going to move forward, you're not going to be overstriding, and you're basically just practicing efficient patterns at a high speed. And when you do this regularly, some of it is going to spill over into the rest of your training, and you're going to find yourself getting more efficient even on your slow, easy runs. The third thing I want to recommend is just running more. The research is clear about this. By accumulating experience and miles, you're naturally going to move toward more efficient movement patterns for your body. And really, that's an overarching lesson about running. There's no way around just putting in the time, putting in the miles, and just by doing that, you're going to become a better runner. So with that in mind, I want to reassure you that your running form is probably fine. You don't need to obsess over all the influencers telling you that you're doing something wrong. That's not to say that you can't make small adjustments, but I think for most people, a total overhaul of your form is going to carry more risk than it does benefits. And at the end of the day, the best thing you can do is just keep running and let your body figure it out. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what I think is more interesting and far more impactful on your actual results is the training methodology that you're putting into practice. So if you want to learn more about that, subscribe to the channel and we will have some videos on that coming very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.